Okay, we are back. Just to reintroduce myself again, I'm Steve Pearson. I'm special advisor at ICER these days, and I will be moderating the voting session and the policy roundtable to follow. But I know most of you who are on the webinar will have been part of the meeting from the beginning and will have been part of the public comment session. And we're going to be talking about randomization issues and unblinding and study protocols and outcome measures. And I just have to acknowledge the pain, the hopes, the fears, the despair, anger, all those things are part of the context here. And I'm just in awe of the courage and the eloquence of the people who came to provide public comment. So we will all have that in the back of our hearts and our minds as we talk about what will seem like more mundane issues. But again, they are part of the really important context, even though we are not the regulatory body that will decide yes or no, or some variation thereof. This discussion will deal with many of the same issues, and we'll hope to provide an additional forum in which, again, all of these different factors can be weighed together and talked about with a degree of transparency and honesty that I think will be good for patients and for our country. So I want to thank the CEPAC for their questions and their other kind of participation this morning, clinical experts and our patient experts, all of whom are with us as we go through the voting questions. And I will remind the CEPAC that the patient experts and clinical experts are available if you wish to direct specific thoughts or questions to them. And patient experts and clinical experts, you are also more than welcome to raise your hand and to make comments as we revisit the evidence and focus them into specific voting questions on both comparative effectiveness and on some of the benefits, potential benefits beyond health as they're measured in a trial, and some of the special ethical priorities that might kind of be another part of the important context here. So with that, I hope, again, the CEPAC is all set up with the voting software. Let's go ahead and look at the first voting question. For all of the questions, we are talking about a patient population of adults with a diagnosis of moderate to severe PTSD. That's obviously linked to the entry criteria for the pivotal trials. And patients may be receiving ongoing therapy and/or medications such as SSRI antidepressants. Okay, with that patient population, the first voting question is, and I want CEPAC folks, don't start voting because we all want to make sure that we have the benefit of the conversation beforehand. So even if you already think you know how you're going to vote, please wait until you've heard the discussion, and then I will let you know when a good time to vote is. The first voting question is current evidence adequate to demonstrate that the net health benefit, that means taking into consideration uncertainty, the risks, and the benefits, the overall net health benefit of MDMA AP is superior to that of not treating patients with MDMA AP. Reem, can I ask you again to briefly summarize the findings and the thoughts of the ICER research team, including your justification for the evidence rating that was given in the report?
Sure. So if you look in the evidence summary, you will see that in table 1, we did give an evidence rating of I, meaning insufficient for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy compared to lycospecific non-assisted psychotherapy. And despite that, we do find these seemingly positive trials, which the results are highlighted in table 4 of the evidence summary, of difference in the CAPS-5 scores, difference in treatment responders, loss of diagnosis and remission. There are potential harms. There is short-term follow-up, and there are real uncertainty about the degree of these potential harms, the frequency of when they happened. And because of that, and because of the concerns about the conduct of the trial, we gave it an insufficient rating.
Okay, thanks. Austin, please go ahead.
Yes, I have on my mind the harms that have been documented in the trials, but also maybe those we've heard about outside of the trials. And I want to be really clear, so I want to ask the ICER team if you can be really clear about the extent to which you received any feedback, cooperation, explanation, and so forth from the manufacturer or the conductor of the clinical trials. I think I know what the answer is, but I want to hear it again. How forthcoming were they in responding to what we've heard about the harms about this?
So I'll answer that. And I'll answer it in part because one of the comments we got that I didn't choose to respond to in the response to comments was from Lycos complaining that they hadn't gotten any notification that we had concerns about the trial until the draft report was published. We sent them an email last December telling them that we had heard concerns like this that were out there, and saying that we wanted both sides of this, and we really thought it would be helpful if they talked to us about it, and they never did.
Okay, we've got several questions coming up, and patient experts and clinical experts also, if we have time, and I'm sure we will, I'll also seek your thoughts on this voting question before the panel votes. Stephanie?
Thanks. I don't have a question more. I just want to deliberate out loud here. So this is tough, and I feel torn in so many different ways. I really appreciate all the input from everyone today. And specifically, I really appreciate all the points that you brought up, Mr. Gould, and articulated really well about the unmet need. And I so see that every day in my practice, right? But all of that said, I just still have overwhelming uncertainty around the trial outcomes and just a lot of uncertainty around the trial outcomes, and then specifically around the safety outcomes and safety data. And so for those reasons, that's going to help determine how I'm going to vote on this question.
Diana or Naomi, would you like to have any comment at this point about, again, this question is teed up to talk about the net health evidence from the clinical trial, but we've obviously been talking about these contextual issues. I just want to make sure, do you guys have anything you'd like to say at this point? If not, that's fine too, but. Diana, go ahead.
Yeah, one thing, and I was thinking I'll bring this up later as well, is just, I do think it's important to remember that the stories we heard are only the stories that came forward. And one thing I commented on a lot about throughout this process is the importance of taking in a lot of the cultural stigma and nuances as well when it comes to, when it comes to utilization of therapies like this that may further prevent people from feeling like they could speak up. And particularly, I am concerned about the history of mistrust between people of color and communities of color, and the way health systems and studies in the past have been done, and how we found throughout studies that people are less likely to be trustworthy, to be trusting of providers who are ethnically dissimilar from them. So I am concerned about the way that safety concerns can be exacerbated on an unanalyzed level when we bringing these other factors into consideration as well.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that point. Naomi, I think I saw your hand up too. Is it still up?
Yes.
Oh, maybe. Okay, go ahead.
I took it down. Yeah, I think, first of all, I definitely want to acknowledge the stories that were shared today. I understand what it is to be vulnerable in telling your story. You know, I know it wasn't easy. And so, but I do want to say that, you know, new options and innovation really is needed. If these if these studies are tainted or don't miss the mark, then veterans deserve more research, like the ones VA is doing with MDMA and psilocybin. The status quo really is failing so many veterans, and we want to make sure that they have high quality, first class, evidence-based healthcare. Full stop. Thank you.
Thanks. And we actually have a separate voting question on unmet need coming up soon. So we'll make sure to accentuate that issue when we do that. Thank you. Joe, go ahead.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you very much. And this is my first meeting, so I hope this is, okay to ask. But am I understanding correctly that in general, what we're talking about in this voting question in this meeting is what we believe to be the effectiveness based on what we see in these trials? And I think, the comment we just heard indicates that there's additional data that's being collected outside of MAP 1 and MAP 2, but to date, what we have is MAP 1 and MAP 2. So I just want to be reflecting a little bit as we think about this around, we heard a couple of stories from folks who have value in the hope. And I think we all want to hold that value in the hope as well. But really, our job today is what do we know from the evidence that's been published to date, not everything we are hopeful about in the future. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Sometimes in working with the companies that are more collaborative, we do receive data that is not in the public domain that can help supplement our work. But your general thrust is absolutely correct. We're meant to focus on the currently available evidence.
All right. Thank you very much.
And sorry, because I said Joe, and I need to be aware myself that we have two Joes. So
Well, I'm sorry if I cut off Dr. Ross. My apologies.
that's right. Somehow, Joe Ross, you fell down on the queue here, but you were number one on the queue originally. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the other Joe. Joe Ross, why don't you go ahead?
Thanks, Steve, and no problem at all. I also appreciated the public comments that were given during that last session, and I was struck a little bit about the different points of view in terms of the constituency of patients who are being represented. And so I was hoping to ask or hear from the clinical experts here on the call whether treatments of PTSD are known to have different expectations for benefit or harm if the PTSD is a result of war or combat versus sexual assault.
Right.
And how that may play into our decision.
Sure. Jessica or you want to answer that? Jessica, go ahead. I bet you can answer. Go ahead.
My general reading of the literature is that it's difficult to identify what we would call moderators of treatment outcome. So whether a rape history or veteran status would moderate the outcome of already existent evidence-based treatments. But on that general note, my reading is also that it seems that veterans have somewhat poor outcomes of already existent evidence-based treatments compared to some other patient groups.
Jessica, you agree?
Yeah, I agree with that. I will say, as far as trauma-focused therapy and the evidence-based treatment, just to make it clear, there is evidence it's effective for all of those different trauma types. But as Yoar said, there is some evidence that there may be reduced effectiveness for veterans, but that might be also tied up in, there's some data that like level of service connection is more the predictor than combat trauma versus other traumas.
Okay, thanks. Aaron?
Thank you. I have a question that I'm hopeful is just a quick, maybe like fact-based clarification for someone who's familiar with the regulatory context here. So at least for me, one particular factor that would play into how heavily I weight the issues related to potential bias in the conduct of the trial would be something that was touched on in the public comments. I think there was a comment which stuck out to me because I think, at least as I understood it, I think it was an assertion that the treatment being submitted to the FDA for approval, if approved, would not be a profitable one for the manufacturer. I may have misunderstood that, but I thought that was a comment that was made. So I just wanted to clarify that. Is this is kind of the usual FDA approval, that there's a manufacturer submitting a drug or treatment and that they would be financially compensated and it's not sort of a pro bono submission or something like that. I just wanted to be clear, this would be a privately held product under the usual kind of financial circumstances.
I will ask David or Reem to comment, but also just, at least from my perspective, I'm not sure how that will change your view of the evidence generated by the trials, but let's go ahead and get that on the table. David or Reem?
I'll give my sense of this. I'm wondering actually if Jessica knows some of this as well, but it's clear that the manufacturer is expecting to have exclusivity to the production of MDMA in the US. So the formulation then would be the only person who could make money off it. And they had published an earlier cost effectiveness analysis where they assumed that MDMA was $120 for a course of treatment. And when we had suggested that price in an early draft of our health economic analysis, that was actually the only feedback we got from Lycos was, you're way low, basically. They didn't quite say it that way, but that was what they were communicating. And now you see the $10,000 that other people have assumed. So that would go to the manufacturer, is our understanding. And that also our understanding is that they're expecting to be licensing providers or certifying providers in what we called LSNAP, the therapy that is done with this, and that they would make money from that. And I think that's what they've done in Australia, but I'm now getting outside of what I know, and I'm hoping that Jessica might know more about this.
I do not know about if drug exclusivity in the US is a plan. It does seem that training providers in their model would be part of the plan moving forward.
Okay, Aaron, I hope that answered your question. Great. Thanks, Jean.
Different kind of question. I so appreciate the points of view and also the analysis. So I'm trying to, and I'm also sitting with the metaphorically with all the people I know who have PTSD, and to my knowledge, only one of them has had access to effective evidence-based treatment. One, probably out of 36 people that I know. So that's a lot of pain walking around in my small little world that is untreated for decades. So that said, I'm hoping someone can help me untangle in my mind the difference between, and I perhaps we can't, the difference between the safety and effectiveness of MDMA in this context and the safety and effectiveness of the psychotherapeutic protocol, LSNAP, whatever we want to call it, which from the most recent comments seems to be where much of the problem, many of the issues are arising. Can those be taken apart in our deliberation, or do I have to consider them together?
Maybe I'll
Oh, no, Reem, go ahead. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll start, and I'm sure you're and Jessica can, again, because we had lots of discussion about this. What we gather from looking at the evidence is when people have access to short-term therapy, trauma-focused therapy, they're actually effective. The problem is exactly what you said, that a lot of people do not have access to these treatments. And I think the additional piece that makes it, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. The additional piece that makes it hard is in the trials that LSNAP arm is not the actually approved or agreed on short-term trauma-focused psychotherapy. So I think that those are all kind of complicating the judgment. But what we know, based on independent, many meta-analyses, short-term focused psychotherapy, actually trauma-focused therapy do work when people can get access to them. The problem is people can't reach them. I don't know, you are or just.
I might have misunderstood. I understood Dr. Ryder's question a little differently. I understood it to mean, is there a difference between the risk benefit of MDMA compared to MDMA in the context of LSNAP specifically? Is that what you're asking, Dr. Yeah. So I think that's a great question. And I think the unfortunate answer is we don't have a lot of great data on that. I think future research, like we want to see MDMA combined with, whether it's MDMA combined with trauma-focused therapy, MDMA combined with other therapeutic models, remembering that this is in the context of a specific therapeutic model in a specific, training, and that like there are different therapeutic models that could be combined in it that might impact the risk and benefit as well. So that like this isn't representative of everything that could happen with MDMA therapy.
And so, thank you. Jean, my short answer was going to be, you can't disentangle them in terms of this vote. They're provided together. Again, how the FDA handles it is an unknown, but they would usually consider this a package deal, if you know what I mean. They're not going to somehow try to tease out MDMA versus the psychotherapy component. Okay, I would need to be sensitive to the time for the other questions, but if we can make these kind of quick, I think we can get 3 more. So Jason?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I wanted to share a bit of my thinking in the akin to how
Yes.
Stephanie started this conversation here. I think for me, these evidence questions do boil down to the issue of, do we have confidence in what are on the surface pretty impressive results from the trials in light of the sort of constellation of issues that have been raised by the ICER team, by others here today around the design, the conduct, and the reporting of the trial. I've been making a list as we've gone along. I won't rehash them for the sake of time. And while some of them I think can be contextualized in isolation, blinding, for example, or others, it's just hard for me to construct a story that gives me confidence that all of these issues have a reasonable explanation that can be sort of set aside and give me confidence in the results that we're seeing, so that perhaps we'll see a fuller or different portrait emerge as other groups take a look at these data and these trials. But just based on what we have available to us, I just have trouble having sort of confidence in the validity and the integrity of the data, and that's where I struggle with, despite all the concerns and all the important unmet needs we find in this space. It comes back to those questions of all the different things we've heard and how to try to understand the portrait they might tell together.
Thank you. Rishi?
Yeah, it actually, Jason made the point that I was going to make, which this really boils down to, do you think that the effect estimate, the average treatment effect estimate from the trials reflects truth? And it's hard, it's really challenging to determine that based on all of the issues we've outlined, starting with the fact that these were small trials with imbalance, which we would expect because of their small size, imbalance in characteristics and prior therapies. My one clarifying question related to trial design is for the clinical experts or the research team. LSNAP, is it reasonable for us to view that as standard of care, given the fact that it's sort of this manufacturer specific psychotherapy? I just would love some clarification on that.
From my point of view, we shouldn't view LSNAP as standard of care as of today.
And I would agree. Yeah, it hasn't been researched as a standalone therapy in any context. It was developed and has exclusively been tested in combination with MDMA.
Thank you.
And Rishi, you'll get your voting question against current standard of care in 30 seconds after we do this vote. I'm sorry, Joe. Yes, we have one more. Go ahead, Joe Porter.
Just in the context of understanding this question and sort of going off of Jean's comment a little bit, when we're asked the question, is current evidence adequate to demonstrate the net health benefit of MDMA AP? It's not just AP, right? It's AP according to this protocol, based on what you just said. And we did hear a lot about variation in that protocol, right? So even the AP as delivered in this varied quite a bit from what we heard. And I just want to make sure I'm grounded in, if this isn't necessarily this drug with this idea of psychotherapy, it really is this drug with a psychotherapy regimen that varied according to a whole host of factors based on what we heard.
So just let me answer that one. Lycos would say that they trained people in a group of psychotherapies that were acceptable to use with MDMA, and that those were the therapies that were administered. and that across those therapies, there was standardization. However, it was a large group. They were quite different from each other. One of the things I've wondered about as FDA is looking at this is, how do you know that some of these aren't good and some of them aren't bad across that? One of the things we would have liked to have had from Lycos was a breakout by therapy to see whether people did differently across therapies. So I think all we can sort of do is call it this group of therapies because we don't really know more than
Got it.
that.
Thank you. That's super helpful. Appreciate it.
Okay, let's go ahead and put up the voting question again. And now you guys can go ahead and vote. Is the current evidence adequate to demonstrate that the net health benefit of MDMA-AP is superior to that of not treating with MDMA-AP? Yes or no? We have 15 voting CEPAC members. There we go. Let's show the results. Okay, 14 no and 1 yes. All right, for purposes of time, let's move ahead to this next voting question, which is framed the same patient population. Is the current evidence adequate to demonstrate that the net health benefit of MDMA-AP is superior to that of short-term trauma-focused psychotherapies, or TFPs? Rishi, this is kind of your question. This is, if you will, the best standard of care. Reem, any other comments you'd like to give to the perspective on the evidence for this question?
The only thing I will add is, in addition to us also giving an insufficient rating for this question, simply we had no direct comparative data comparing MDMA-assisted psychotherapy to short-term trauma-focused therapy. We did do a qualitative comparison, which you can find under research question 2 in the evidence summary on page 12 and 13. And in that comparison, again, it's really hard to say because the direct data we thought was insufficient. So it's hard to say with any certainty that we know how do they compare.
Okay. Any questions? All right, let's go ahead and vote on this question. I don't think I'll read it all to you again. It's just MDMA-AP superior to short-term trauma-focused psychotherapy. Is the evidence adequate? Okay, 15 no, 0 yes. All right, now we do shift gears to talk about, again, some of the potential benefits that could be provided by a treatment beyond its health effects and certain special ethical priorities. So we'll just run through the questions as they come. The first one is around, this is just to help inform judgments that can be made of the overall long-term value for money. We like to make the point that cost effectiveness and thinking about uncertainty is certainly an anchor, but to any judgment about value for money, but that there are other considerations, and that's why we want to discuss and vote on the following. So the first is there substantial unmet need despite currently available treatments? And your voting answers will range from strongly disagree with that statement to strongly agree. There is substantial unmet need. We heard from Mr. Gould about this. I think the ICER team has also commented on it, but Reem, why don't you go ahead and share briefly the perspective, and then we can open it up to other comments or questions about unmet need.
Well, I think we've heard very explicitly that there's a huge unmet need in this area. And I think the unmet need has multiple aspects to it. One is that there is an issue with access to care, but there is also few people who are quote unquote cured or fully recover from this, and that there is a lot of opportunity for additional treatment to help in this space. This is what we found and what we've heard from different people.
Okay. Jean, you made a comment earlier that kind of touched on this too. Clinical experts or patient experts, is there any other kind of commentary on this question that you'd like to add before we vote?
I just have a brief comment.
Sure.
Because I think it's an open question whether the so-called unmet need is mainly due to poor or low effectiveness of already existent evidence-based treatment, or if it's mainly due to, as pinpointed by Dr. Mustafa, limited access to existent evidence-based treatments. I think it's important to distinguish those two aspects.
Jessica, from your perspective, what are the key drivers of the unmet need?
I definitely agree. Access is a huge issue. So majority of people in the US who have PTSD will not receive evidence-based PTSD treatment. It's a little different across veterans and civilians, with trauma-focused treatments being rolled out in the VA system, but even there is still definitely issues with access or wait lists. There is a subset of people within trauma-focused therapies that show suboptimal response. So I think we don't have perfect treatments right now, but we do have effective treatments that very unfortunately most people have a hard time getting access to.
Yeah, thanks. Naomi, go ahead.
Just wanted to mention, you know, with veterans, avoidance is a big barrier to care. They also avoid disclosure of their traumas. But there are stark disparities in access to care, and particularly for rural veterans. I just want to make sure I threw that out there as well. So yes, there is.
I just want to echo Naomi. That's such an important point to understand about PTSD is avoidance is a cardinal symptom. So that is a challenge, even if someone does have access, is sometimes people avoid treatment. You know, you're asking someone who wants to avoid talking about the trauma to come in usually once a week and talk about the trauma. So I will say, I think that also to me indicates that we need more choices for PTSD treatments as well.
Great, thank you. So noted. Jean.
So thinking about access issues, and all of CEPAC knows that I talk about these a lot, especially for people in rural areas, but this intervention, I will point out, requires twice the workforce than the other evidence-based program alternatives, and a high cost. You know, that's a concern. We don't have access already. We don't have enough workforce already.
All right, thanks. Diana, go ahead.
Yeah, and I don't mean to keep rehashing this point, but I do think it's really important, especially as we're talking about gaps when it comes to geography and such, that recent data has shown that over 85% of psychologists and psychiatrists in the US self-identify as white. And when we look at the way that, again, this can lead to very real disparities between people's willingness to seek care and how people from ethnic minorities have reported to be less likely to use mental health services, that is something that definitely plays into the role of unmet needs as well.
Thank you. That's a very helpful insight, and it's also related to the next voting question we will take in a second. Why don't we go ahead and vote on unmet need? So again, just make sure you get your orientation straight here. 1 is strongly disagree, 5 is strongly agree. And you are agreeing or disagreeing to the statement, there is substantial unmet need despite currently available treatments. Go ahead and vote. Okay, we're still waiting for 1. There it is. Thank you. Okay. 12 strongly agree and 3 agree. All right. Thank you. Okay, let's move to the next voting question. Here, the question is, this condition is of substantial relevance for people from a racial / ethnic group that have not been equitably served by the healthcare system. So Reem, again, from the report, the perspectives on prevalence and other aspects of this that you guys thought of, and then we'll open it up for comments and questions.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So I think what we found in the report that there is an increased prevalence of PTSD among certain racial and ethnic groups and minority groups. However, when we applied the data to the HIDE score, the scores for the most part were pretty close to 1. That's kind of overall what we found.
Okay, and for those not familiar with our HIDE score, it's kind of a comparison of prevalence data between populations, and if the number's way far off from 1, it means that there's a much higher prevalence in certain racial or ethnic subpopulations as compared to others. So let's talk more about this question. Joe, we've got a couple of comments or questions. Joe Porter first.
Sure. Yeah, I just want to reiterate that diagnosed prevalence is one thing and actual prevalence is something else. And when we look at the underlying issues that generally bring up a PTSD diagnosis, those underlying traumas tend to be at higher prevalence in these populations that we've talked about. And I think Diana's brought this forward in a couple of places. And in addition to that, finding culturally appropriate care for something that's this sensitive is really, really a challenge. So, I think from the inequitably served by the healthcare system and probably underdiagnosed, I just want to make sure that those things aren't lost in the, in a score that maybe looks a little bit more even than the reality shows.
Yeah, the point you're making is that there's obviously a connection between, well, there's both underreporting potentially in certain subpopulations, and their traditional access to mental health care is less culturally sensitive access as well. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm just building on what Joe said and kind of back to a couple of things that strings that Diana, you've pulled that I really appreciate. While the prevalence, as been stated, is somewhat similar, a little bit higher in people who are BIPOC, we do know there's multiple studies that show that people who are BIPOC, and specifically in one study I'm thinking of, people who are Black, are less likely to report symptoms of PTSD. And part of that is thought to be related to past histories of medical discrimination, which we know is very real, particularly in people that are BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And then also because of the avoidance symptoms that were talked about earlier, which are which is a core symptom of PTSD. And then further, a different set of evidence, but there's other evidence that shows us that people who are Black, again, are less likely to report sexual assaults. And there's a lot of factors that go into why that may be, but that, of course, is another really important etiology for the development of PTSD. And so that's what I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tara?
Thanks. Yeah, first, I agree with what everyone just brought up was a racial ethnic unmet need. And just wanted to also bring up other vulnerable groups. And a lot of this conversation is focused on veterans. And I think, we all know that they have not been historically adequately served by the healthcare system. I know that's been improving, but historically that has been a big problem in our country. So the fact that they're disproportionately affected by PTSD, I think, brings to light really the importance of treating this condition, just given, how historically underserved that population has been.
I think we have talked a fair amount about veterans as part of this. We'll talk about the VA as a system in the policy roundtable, but I just want to kind of get a sense of the CEPAC. I'd like to suggest that we don't have a voting question that identifies the VA or other kind of groups that could be also subject to inadequate healthcare over the years. So we can kind of make a comment to stipulate that as part of kind of this vote on racial and ethnic. We can also stipulate that in a way this certainly addresses or is relevant for people in who are veterans. Does that sound reasonable to everybody?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, we'll do that then. Thank you. Rebecca? Oops, you're on mute, sorry.
I'm so sorry. I have in mind the other populations who are oppressed and the oppression causing it, which is also under reported underdiagnosed for PTSD, LGBTQ, all those who are oppressed by discrimination in various forms is something we haven't talked about, but I think is another area for us to just have in mind as we consider this question.
That's another excellent point. Any opposition to the idea of including that? Just to note that there are other groups, and we can name veterans and LGBTQ as groups that have, in a sense, suffered hardships, oppression, and lack of adequate access to healthcare. I think that's good. Stephanie, and then David, and then I think we can take a vote. Stephanie?
Thanks. Building on that last comment, I wonder if it would also be worth considering adding a statement about people who land at intersections. So like maybe a Black person who is also someone who is non-binary in gender, for example. Thank you.
So noted. David?
I think that as we're thinking about those groups and the association of PTSD with sexual assault, that it would feel inappropriate not to mention women as a group that suffer more PTSD because of sexual assault than men.
All right, so I think what we should do is vote on the racial ethnic, because that's the question that we're going to march through forward in time with on other topics. But we will note these other groups that I think are relevant. But I don't want you to vote, in a sense, lumping those into your vote at this point in time. They will be separately noted along with the vote on racial and ethnic groups, okay? So let's go ahead and take that vote. 1 is strongly disagree, 5 is strongly agree that this is a condition of substantial relevance for people from, I could say, 1 or more racial or ethnic groups that have not been equitably served by the healthcare system. All right, we have our 15. 9 agree, 3 strongly agree, 2 neutral, and 1 disagree. Okay. All right. Now, the next 2 questions are also about judgments that people will make about the overall long-term value of a treatment, of this treatment. So we're asking you to indicate your level of agreement with the following statements. And now we're not just talking about the condition, we're really talking about MDMA AP again. So you've already voted almost unanimously and then unanimously that you don't think the evidence is adequate to say that it provides a net health benefit versus other options and with the current evidence. So with that in mind, though, we wanted to always ask whether there are the following effects that could happen outside of those quote unquote clinical effects. So the next question is, the treatment is likely to produce substantial improvement in caregivers' quality of life and or their ability to pursue their own education, work, and family life. Now, again, this is tricky, but I feel like I need to make the distinction. If you have to think about 2 things in conjunction to take this vote. One is you have to think, would an effective treatment produce substantial improvement in caregivers' quality of life and or their ability to pursue their education, et cetera? And 2 is, do I have enough evidence that this is an effective treatment? So you kind of have to think of those 2 together. And this is the first time we've had the questions framed this way. That's why I'm kind of doing a little bit more storyboarding of this. But that's the way it's intended to work, that you do need to think about your judgment of the relative effectiveness and the strength of that evidence. And then based on that, do you think that it is likely, is the treatment likely to produce substantial improvement in caregivers' quality of life? So I think it's fair for us to talk about the impact on caregivers of